Hi everyone, I'm Carmen, Managing Digital Editor at Ms., and I'm here with Terri Poore, the Policy Director at the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence and Violence. So thank you. Hey, thank you for being here. I'm very excited to talk to you. I loved receiving your email of interest in which you were like, I have been doing this work for many years.
5 million years.
Yeah, and
with dinosaurs.
Well, and I just feel like it's, this is such an interesting turning point. And I love that the theme is going beyond that breakthrough that we've seen over the last couple of years with Me Too. But I also think, we're talking a lot today about maybe the idea that maybe we were approaching things wrong, or maybe these strategies that we were using didn't work. But the work that you've done around policy and the workshop you're doing today around this idea of like, there are policies that make us feel good and then there are policies that work. What are the policies that work? Like, what are the things having done this work for a little while, are actually successful ways of approaching this problem?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that we work on year in and year out that we know works is funding survivor services and prevention.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah. So we are always working at the federal level on funding programs like the Sexual Assault Services Program and the Rape Prevention and Education Program, because we know when those funds get out to states and local communities to support rape crisis centers, to support prevention educators, then they can get out in their communities and provide the services and the prevention. And demand is skyrocketing for those services.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily know that the rates of sexual assault are increasing, but with the attention on the issue, more people are feeling comfortable to come forward for services. 20 years ago, prevention educators had a terrible time getting schools or parents to want to talk about sexual violence, and that's really changed. So the demand for the programs has increased, and so we need to increase the funding.
Yeah, and it's a tumultuous time when it comes to policies for survivors.
Yeah.
But what's sort of the landscape that survivors are facing now at the state and federal level?
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of the context is obviously with the Me Too breakthrough. That has yielded a lot of excellent conversations, progress. It's meant that every policymaker wants to have a sexual assault bill. Some of those bills are great. Some of those bills are like, not as great. I think we've also found with another context that we've been experiencing the past year was the Kavanaugh nomination, where we really saw Survivor center stage, and a lot of advocates had a lot of strong feelings about how she was treated. And, that we work with the Senate Judiciary Committee to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act and all those sorts of things. So that left a lot of us with strong feelings about, it's not always a neutral approach to the issue of sexual assault, and that we really expect policymakers to stand up for survivors. So
yeah.
A chance to change the landscape for us to some extent. Things like right now we're trying to pass the Violence Against Women Act, and it's really politicized in the Senate, especially around issues we need to move forward, like stronger protections for survivors on tribal lands, holding non-Indian offenders accountable on tribal lands. Well, we're getting pushback about that. We're getting pushback about the non-discrimination provisions in VAWA that protect LGBTQ survivors. There's talk about wanting a religious exemption. So those are all things we're having to really push back against in this context.
Yeah, and I mean, it feels like a fight where we're fighting to stop ourselves from slipping backwards.
Yeah.
But what are some of the things, in terms of going beyond the breakthrough, what are some of the policies you would like to see, sort of take shape in the next couple of years or in the course of this generation that we're in right now?
Yeah, we're seeing some interesting things going on both at the federal and state level about workplace reforms. I mean, going beyond the liability approach to sexual harassment to really looking at how do we make it more possible for people in workplaces to come forward. So there's the Be Heard in the Workplace Act at the federal level. We're working a lot with the National Women's Law Center on the 20 states by 2020, looking at state approaches to really strengthening sexual harassment laws at the state level. The Be Heard Act has a lot of provisions, but it includes things like you might not generally think of you may, but not everyone might think of associated with the issue of sexual violence, like eliminating the tipped wage, which we know often people in the service industry feel like they have to accept sexual harassment or something like that to get their tips to make their living. We think it makes more sense for people to just get a living wage. So we're connecting the dots on a lot of different how different policies impact the issue of sexual violence and survivors. That's one example. We're also looking at campus issues. So we really think campuses should be doing climate surveys. So we're looking at how to include, Representative Jackie Spear from California has legislation to require campus climate surveys. We're looking at, can we get that in the Higher Ed Act, just as one example. And then on the state level, lots of states everywhere from California to Texas to Colorado are looking at how to protect survivors on campus, knowing that right now at the federal level we're seeing rollbacks of Title IX. So a lot of actions happening at the state level.
Yeah, and well, that makes me wonder, like, what are some of the policies that you would say are those feel-good policies that aren't actually doing much to advance the cause of like preventing, mitigating, and addressing sexual violence? And then what would you say are some model policies at the state level or even within institutions or at the federal level that you think sort of should be celebrated or maybe even, popularized?
Yeah, I think in the past we've, including myself, have focused advocacy around solely or primarily the criminal justice system. And what we know is that only a very small percentage of survivors actually go through that system. And so a lot of advocates are turning their focus not 100% away from the criminal justice system, but we've spent a lot of money and effort to try to improve prosecutions of sexual assault. We haven't seen a lot of change in that regard. There still may be things that we can do, but we're kind of focusing other places. And so, for example, one thing that people are working on in states, I was just talking with the New Jersey Coalition Against Sexual Assault. They were just successful in extending their civil statute of limitations. So not the criminal, but really in response to looking at widespread sexual violence that's happened in some faith-based communities, and survivors desire not so much to get money, but to hold institutions accountable.
Yeah.
So New Jersey is an example, several other states where they're really working on extending their civil statute of limitations so survivors can come forward and hold those institutions accountable. We know oftentimes if you can hold people financially accountable, you can really get their attention. So that's an example of sort of a pivot away from strictly criminal justice policy to a broader look at it. So some states are pursuing extending the criminal statute of limitations, which we don't oppose, and I think it's a good idea, but we're really more focused on the civil statute of limitations.
Yeah, and you touched on this a bit before. You talked about like Native survivors and their fight to be able to pursue justice.
Yes.
And when we have patchwork laws like we do with sexual violence and harassment, people inevitably fall through those cracks, right? And often it's going to be the survivors at the margin. So
Absolutely.
How can advocates and activists work to advance more comprehensive policies? Like, what guidance would you say that you could offer folks who want to push for policy and they want it to be more than just feel-good policy, but they also, they want to make sure they're doing it right and not leaving anyone out?
Absolutely. Great question. So at Reliance.org, the Reliance website, we have a district advocacy toolkit. And so people can go download that for free, obviously. And it really gives, first of all, just in nuts and bolts, how to talk with your members of Congress and that sort of thing. We really encourage people, even if they don't feel comfortable lobbying or they can't lobby, you can always have an education meeting with your member of Congress, with your senator, to talk to them about the issues you care about. And we recommend that you really elevate the issues for marginalized communities. So talk about, it's so important, the tribal organizations that we work with, the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, and organizations like that do such a fantastic job advocating on those issues. But we know they need mainstream organizations and advocates also to really raise those issues. So having that meeting with your representative or your senator and say, I care about tribal sovereignty. I care that survivors on tribal lands that have just these incredibly high rates of sexual violence, that tribes have the ability to hold those offenders accountable. And I think they should be funded. That's another issue. They should be funded to provide victim services. So that can be a great a great thing to do. And also, if those things feel too technical, they can always just go and talk about their experience too. So we don't want people to feel like Congress and policy is some sort of magic system. It's we elect these folks, and we should be meeting with them, to talk about what we care about.
Yeah, well, and I mean, it also makes me think about the challenge that Ms. brought against the FBI's definition of rape just a few years ago to get that broadened and changed too, because that was obviously a way in which a lot of survivors were being excluded because the definition of rape was so narrow. Yeah. And so in terms of language, have you seen any policies that have really made a good effort to have inclusive language that does sort of encompass all survivors? Like, is that part of the toolkit? Maybe like this notion of how do we make sure that it's not gender specific, that it's not situation specific?
Yeah, those are all things we're looking at. Recently, Senator Booker and a number of other senators put out a resolution. I don't have a number for you offhand, but it was a resolution really looking at how do we protect and uphold the issues of all survivors. And so it really goes through and talks about issues for immigrant survivors, for LGBTQ survivors, for all those sorts of things. Those are all things that we really care about. And I think we do a fairly good job in the toolkit on that. We probably could always do better, but I think we've improved around those issues in the past 10 years specifically, and really that's because we've been held accountable by advocates from those communities. So I think that's so important.
Yeah, and how do you feel that folks on those margins can how can the movement at large support amplifying and elevating those voices of the people who have maybe been least served by these policies, but who might need them the most?
Yeah, I mean, we really try to listen to survivor activists from communities impacted, and I think we're doing a better job. You heard Monica talk some about that this morning at the plenary, just about how we've moved from having policy committees that are made up of all professionals in the movement to survivor activists from a whole variety of communities, and really kind of taking this step off our high horse and being like, we need to listen. Just because we've been doing this work a long time doesn't mean we have all the answers. And for that reason, we've really been looking at the issue of mandatory reporting of child sexual abuse, because we've had amazing survivor activists like Luz Marquez Gumbo and Aisha Shahida Simmons, I think she's presenting right now, actually say, hey, this is how this really affects us in our communities, and so we need to look at that. So we've tried to listen to broaden the range of voices that we're listening to and take seriously what they have to say.
Yeah, and then for the activists tuning in, because I have a feeling there's a few of them. As someone who's been working on the policy side, I know that even in the work I do, I've seen that, a big part of pushing for policy is making sure that there's other people pushing with you, right?
Absolutely.
So what would you say are some of the most effective strategies that folks can take right now to take action and really push the needle on sexual assault policy? And what are the kinds of policies they should be fighting for?
Yeah. So I think there's always a range of things people can do. And like I've said, I think it's great if folks go out in groups, like find a friend or several friends or 10 friends and say, you know what, let's go instead of going to lunch on Friday, let's go meet with our senator. And the other thing is people think it's better to have an appointment and all that, but your senator's your senator. You can always show up in their district office and say, hey, we're here because we care about the issue of sexual assault and we want to talk about it. Better probably to make an appointment, but really I want people to see that as something they can access. But then there's always inside-outside strategies too. I mean, that's very kind of an inside baseball strategy, an inside Capitol Hill strategy. But, the activism we're seeing, like during the Kavanaugh hearing when survivors were just coming to the Hill with signs and T-shirts, and I think that's incredibly effective too. I think it takes all of us working at it from different angles, pushing your local program to be more inclusive, and to raise these issues. I mean, I think it's all to the benefit of survivors of ending sexual violence. And in terms of what issues, I mean, we, as Monica said this morning, we are always working on the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act and really trying to make sure that it's responsive to the needs of marginalized communities. At the same time, VAWA isn't the end-all be-all, so we're doing things like trying to close the law enforcement consent loophole. So there's a lot of states where it doesn't say specifically that law enforcement officers can't be sexual with anyone in their custody or anyone under the color of law. So, some people think, well, you raise the consent defense, but we don't believe that law enforcement officers, you've got that power imbalance. So that's another issue that folks are working on at the state and federal level. So issues like that.
Awesome. And having done this work, what impacts have you seen from good policy? Like, what do you know the potential is there for policy to really shift culture and sort of set new standards and, help advance this fight to make sure that one day these policies won't be necessary because violence won't be happening?
Yeah, well, what I believe is that funding survivor services helps support people in their healing. And as people heal and become more empowered, they're more able to speak up. And I do see a sea change with this issue. I don't think policy is the end-all, be-all. Ultimately, I think we change people through hearts and minds.
Yeah.
But I like to look at Congress as a bunch of human beings that we need to talk to about this issue that have the leaders, that have the really pulpit. And so I just look at that as another place where we are doing organizing. And so I've seen a lot of change, a lot of interest in this moment, a lot of interest in really actually doing something and also focusing more on prevention. So I think that's exciting. I think communities get that more than they did, and there's a real interest in addressing the root causes of violence.
Awesome. Well, I think those are all of my questions for you. But thank you so much, and thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes, and I will definitely link to the toolkit in the description of this video. So get clicking, taking action.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.